The Memphis Grizzlies will play the New York Knicks tonight, and on paper, this could be a real good win for Memphis, but we'll break down why this is an intriguing matchup coming up on Locked On Grizzlies.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am your host, DeMichael Cole, beat writer for the Commercial Appeal. We thank you again for joining us on Locked On Grizzlies. I've been covering the Grizzlies now for the past 4 or so months. I got here in December, around the time the team went on the 11-game win streak and reached the status now where they're the number 2 seed in the Western Conference. And I mean, they're playing really, really good basketball. So thanks for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. And just remember that Locked On Grizzlies is free and available on YouTube and everywhere else you get your podcasts. So if that's Apple Podcasts, we need you to go download, subscribe, and give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. And if that's here on YouTube, just make sure you subscribe to the channel, comment, and, show us some love on Locked On Grizzlies. So today I'm running solo again. Sean Coleman will be back with us actually next week, the co-host of Locked On Grizzlies. I cannot wait to get Sean back and, to have us run this show together. I think it's going to be a fun run for Grizzlies fans. Just me and Sean, we've talked about, some of the ideas that we have, and it's going to be pretty fun. But, today the Grizzlies have an interesting game against the New York Knicks. So you look at the Knicks on paper, not in the play-in after last season's, great run to the playoffs where they were one of the top teams in the Eastern Conference, and Tom Thibodeau won, NBA Coach of the Year. This season they've kind of plateaued out to the 12th seed in the Eastern Conference. But don't let the record fool you. The Knicks are playing really good basketball right now. They've won 3 games in a row, and they're trending upwards. But the Grizzlies, won't be fazed by any of that. The Grizzlies have gotten 2 days between home games, which I can't state it enough. That's a rarity in the NBA, being able to play a home game, have 2 days where you don't have to travel. You can sit at home and you get back on your home floor. So the Grizzlies will have that extra rest. We'll see how that works for them. But this is the second meeting between the Grizzlies and the Knicks this season. The first meeting happened on February 2nd, a 120-108 win for the Grizzlies. I was there in New York City at Madison Square Garden, and what a scene it was. I mean, the first thing I noticed before the game was, there were Ja Morant jerseys. There were fans out to watch Ja Morant warm up. It was a sight to see. It was just interesting to see from that perspective how nationally Morant has been received. And you watch the player intros. They named, they said all the starters in the Grizzlies lineup. And then when they said Ja Morant, I mean, you would have thought he was a starter for the Knicks, how loud the ovation was. So that game really, that's New York City. That's Madison Square Garden. That's, one of the biggest stages in basketball. And Morant, he received a warm welcome. But, that game was also on ESPN. Morant had a decent game, but the Grizzlies won 120-108. That game was more about Zaire Williams. If you remember, Zaire Williams in Philadelphia, one game before this game, had took, the shot with the game on the line when Ja Morant passed it to him in the corner. He missed the shot. Overall, had a really tough shooting day. And I remember just talking to him about that afterwards, and he said that, he was hitting the wall and he was kind of down on himself. And it was a tough time for the Rook, but Ja Morant, after that game, showed that he had confidence in Zaire Williams, basically said if he had that same shot, he'd give it to him again. He'd go to him again. And lo and behold, the very next game, Zion Williams busted out career high. I believe he had 21 points, and he was the third leading Grizzlies scorer behind Morant and Jaren Jackson in that game. But he was hot, and just to see Zion Williams have that type of game in Madison Square Garden, it was very telling to just how this Grizzlies team and the culture of this team is. But one of the biggest memories from that game, just from an entertainment perspective, was the incident with Desmond Bain and Julius Randle in the fourth quarter. They're going into that timeout. If you remember, Desmond Bain and the Grizzlies were in their huddle, and Julius Randle walked over to the huddle, which led to Desmond Bain giving him a little push and Randle pushing back, and they got double technicals, and an entire situation unfolded right there. Nothing too crazy, but we asked Desmond Bain yesterday about that at shoot around, and he said, there's no bad blood there. There's nothing that's gonna linger over into this game. It was just a competitive thing, but he did say that he hasn't seen you know that happen. He hasn't seen players come into the opposing team's huddle, so that was the way he felt was appropriate to react. But like he said, there's no bad blood. There's not much probably that's gonna come of that situation that'll linger over into this game. But this matchup against the Knicks, what you have is a bad offensive team. The Knicks, of course, any team that's coached by Tom Thibodeau is going to hang their hat on the defensive end. But the difference between last year's Knicks and this year's Knicks is, you don't have a guy like Derrick Rose who's been injured most of the season, and you don't have, certain pieces like, Reggie Bullock, who has went over, with the Mavs and playing a really big role with them now. Certain pieces are missing from that team, and you went out and got a guy like Evan Fournier, who's been up and down. In the Kemba Walker project, it just didn't work out. They thought, getting Kemba back in Madison Square Garden, where he's had some of his biggest moments, as we all know, the Kodiak Kemba moment in college with UConn, the shot over Pitt, buzzer beater, and all of that. But that reclamation project just didn't work out as planned. So the Knicks offense struggles. They're 30th in the NBA in assists. So what you get when you watch them, it's a lot of Julius Randle, a lot of RJ Barrett isolations, and it's not pretty to watch. So even if you look at it from what the Knicks are good at, two of their best things, their best attributes are rebounding and blocking shots. And you know what team is number one in the NBA in rebounding and blocking shots? It's the Grizzlies. So even the stats where the Knicks are top tier, the Grizzlies are still a little bit better. But as I mentioned a little bit earlier, don't let the record fool you. I believe the Knicks at this point of the season they have 20, 28, 29 wins. And the problem here with that is the Knicks are hot. The Knicks are one of the hottest teams playing right now. They came on this Western Conference road trip, right? And the expectation was this was going to be one of their hardest trips of the year. A 28-38 Knicks team, and they've dominated. They've dominated the Western Conference. First game was against the Suns. You remember that game? That was the game where Cameron Johnson for the Suns on ESPN erupted, 38 points, and they came back to win that game. But Julius Randle was ejected in the third quarter. Knicks had a pretty controllable lead. He had 25 points. He was dominating the Suns. If Randle doesn't get ejected, they more than likely win that game, no matter how hot Cam Johnson is, because the Suns couldn't stop Julius Randle. So there's that game. And then there are the three games that came after that. Blowout win over the Clippers, current number 8 seed. Blowout win over the Kings. Blowout win over the Mavs by 30. So the only loss on this West Coast road trip was to the Suns by 1 point in a game where Julius Randle got ejected. That can't be overstated. This team has been playing really good basketball. This is going to be a really good test for the Grizzlies. You look at their weapons. RJ Barrett and Julius Randle. Those two guys have been playing some of the best basketball. Like 2 games ago, before 2 games ago, Julius Randle had 46 points, 10 rebounds. RJ Barrett during his streak in these 3 games, I believe he's topped 25 points twice. He has been cooking lately. So those two guys, those are the head of the snake, and they're pretty hard to stop. So we talked about the Grizzlies and their problem guarding these wing guys. RJ Barrett is next up on the list. Jaren Jackson, Steven Adams, Brandon Clark. They're going to have their hands full with Julius Randle. So the matchup from the Knicks game, there's one matchup in particular that I want to focus on. There's one that I cannot wait to see. And my hint to you is it doesn't involve Ja Morant. This matchup does not involve Ja Morant. We're going to talk about that. But before we get into that, let's talk about how BetOnline has some interesting odds for these games today. The Grizzlies, for example, 9.5-point favorites over the Knicks. They beat the Knicks by 12 in the Garden, but 9.5 over a team who is pretty much, as I just mentioned, blew out the last 3 Western Conference opponents, and even the loss to the Suns was a 1-point loss. So 9.5-point favorites. So basically, you're either going to think the Grizzlies are going to win by double digits, or the Knicks will cover and lose that game by less than double digits, or possibly win. So remember, man, the Knicks are playing really good ball, but so that's going to be an interesting one as well. But that's not the only notable odds you can find on BetOnline. You got the Lakers being 4.5-point favorites over the Wizards, despite just losing that game to the Houston Rockets. It was a bad loss for the Lakers, but BetOnline.net, you can still go find them being 4.5-point favorites over the Wizards. And how about the Hawks at 6 points favorites over the Clippers? So some interesting, some questionable ones out there, but go to betonline.net, see what fits for you, and try to win you some money. But not just basketball. There's not just basketball on there. There's not just NBA. You have college basketball. March Madness is humming right now. ACC basketball tournament. Big Ten basketball tournament bets. BetOnline has you covered with that. But BetOnline also has you covered with hockey, boxing, UFC, and much more. So head on over to the website to learn more about those matchups that you could potentially like. So I'm going to tell you about some matchups that I like, particularly one matchup in this Grizzlies-Knicks game. Julius Randle versus Jaren Jackson Jr. This is a playoff-like matchup for Jaren Jackson Jr. And I'm going to tell you why. I'm about to explain why, because the number one question is, can he avoid foul trouble? Julius Randle is one of the more aggressive power forwards in the NBA when it comes from attacking. He has the ball in his hands a lot. He's going to drive the ball into your chest repeatedly. That puts an emphasis on Jaren Jackson Jr. One, not just being able to block the shot, but being in position. Because if he's not in position, the referee's going to blow that whistle time and time and time again, and he's going to go to the bench. He's not going to be in rhythm, and Taylor Jenkins is going to have some decisions to make if that's the case. Also, how will Jaren Jackson Jr. attack on offense? One thing I've noticed lately, we make such a big deal out of how Jaren Jackson Jr. should attack these mismatches because he's 6'11". 9 times out of 10, he's going to be guarded against guys who are smaller. And the way the NBA plays now with, basically multiple small forwards, in these 2 to 3 wings on the court in between a point guard and a center, he's usually guarded against guys a lot smaller than him. And we always say, he should be dominating those matchups. You know what I've noticed lately? The matchup that he's dominating is the matchup against those bigger guys, where he can use his fluidity, his ability to, that nice Euro step that he has, and Jaren Jackson can really dribble the ball. He has some skill. And when he plays guys his size, it really is showcased even more. Julius Randle is a guy I would consider his size a little bit shorter, but from a stocky perspective, and Julius Randle moves his feet really well on defense. That's going to be a matchup I want to see. We did mention Jaren Jackson Jr. last game against the Knicks, 26 points, 10 rebounds. Great performance. And also in that game, when I talk about him avoiding foul trouble, Julius Randle was held to 7 of 18 shooting. And again, I believe he had 18 points, 12 rebounds, 9 assists. So how Jaren Jackson Jr. attacks this matchup, it's going to be important to see. Because I did a story, you can go find it on commercialappeal.com about the importance of Jaren Jackson Jr. to the Grizzlies. And in that story, I basically said if the Grizzlies want to go to the finals, if the Grizzlies want to win a championship, Jaren Jackson matters as much as anyone. And the numbers back it up. Take three-pointers, for example. When you're playing the Grizzlies, teams, when it comes to Morant, teams are going to give him the three-pointers simply because he's the number one paint scorer in NBA. It's either you play him closely and he's jets past you and he gets in the paint where it's curtains more times than not for teams. So you want to give him the shot. I mean, not give it to him from an open perspective, but you would rather have to close out later rather than, trying to take away his space and allowing him to drive to the basket. So there's that. Desmond Bane is the one guy who opposing teams, opposing players will always say, that's the shooter. That's the guy we cannot leave every single time. Zion Williams hasn't earned that respect yet in NBA. He's made some big shots for this team, but teams aren't afraid of Zion Williams shooting the ball. No team is afraid right now of Jaren Jackson shooting the ball. And Steven Adams, he's not going to take that shot. So when it comes down to it, Jaren Jackson is the one guy who can put that fear back into the opponents. Ja Morant can make probably maybe 5 threes before teams say, okay, look, we can't do this no more. Because at the end of the day, Ja Morant at the basket is automatic right now. So they're giving him that. Jaren Jackson Jr. is the one guy who can help Desmond Bane the most. And in the story on commercialappeal.com, I pointed out some numbers in particular where Jaren Jackson Jr., when he doesn't make a three-pointer, I believe the team has a 5-9 record. Whereas in games where he's made 3 or more three-pointers, the team is 13-2. Big gap. There was also some numbers in terms of three-man lineups. Looking at the Grizzlies' best three-man lineups this season, and you probably say, why three-man lineups? Well, when you look at five-man lineups, 5-man lineups aren't on the court as much. So you can find three-man lineups that have played more than 300 minutes together. You won't find a 5-man lineup on the Grizzlies teams that has played 300 minutes because, injuries, COVID, all the players pretty much have been affected in some way by these things or injuries and whatnot. So 5-man lineups, you're looking at roughly 150 minutes, 180 minutes. A lot of these 3-man lineups, you can find 300 plus minutes. But Jaren Jackson, DeAnthony Melton, Desmond Bane, one of the most, I think, 3-man efficient lineup on the Grizzlies at over 300 minutes. Defensively, net rating over 9. And then the third highest 3-man lineup, Jaren Jackson, and I believe it was Tyus Jones and Brandon Clark. So again, 2 guys off the bench, and that's what I got out of that. Taylor Jenkins plays Jaren Jackson a lot with the bench unit when he staggers him with Ja Morant. Because we saw in the 12-game stretch, when Ja Morant was out with the knee injury, Jaren Jackson Jr. shined. He had 3 games with 25 or more points. He averaged over 17.5 points a game. And in that stretch, what you got was a guy who was aggressive, a guy who was able to have the ball in his hands and get to the free throw line. And that's all things he's capable of doing on a nightly basis. This matchup against Julius Randle will be a it will be a good playoff test. Julius Randle is physical. He's gonna body him up and he's gonna test him out. And we'll see how Jaren Jackson responds. But I mean, just recently, Jaren Jackson didn't finish a game on Sunday against the Houston Rockets because Taylor Jenkins said he was out of rhythm. He had 5 fouls, 13 minutes, and only scored 8 points. And we'll talk more about how Taylor Jenkins makes those tough rotational decisions and calls down the stretch. But let me tell you, an easier call you could make would be Built Bar. Built Bars prioritize good taste. Then they do that magic, from a health perspective, making these bars the healthiest they can be, and it's half as many calories and just as much chocolate as the candy bars. And you can't forget, Built Bars are covered 100% in real chocolate. So I have a personal love for the new white chocolate cookies and cream, but there are many more options to choose from. Milk brownie, coconut almond. Just go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKED15 and get 15% off your order. Again, promo code LOCKED15 and you can get 15% off your order. The Grizzlies rotation is very fluid. It's I would describe it as, in the first half it's set in stone, and then in the second half it's very much based off of what happens in the first half. Taylor Jenkins confirmed this when I asked him about it at shoot around, because there are some decisions he makes in the second half that don't line up with first half decision. It's usually based on how players are playing, who's playing well with what lineup, what defense the opposing team is playing, and what lineup the Grizzlies can use to counteract that. So I mentioned that one decision that he went to recently was Tyus Jones came into that last game against the Pelicans earlier in the first quarter. And when he came in, Ja Morant was still in the game. So they ran that Ja Morant, Tyus Jones lineup. He went with Tyus Jones over John Conchar. So over the extra wing, you had Tyus Jones, Ja Morant, DeAnthony Melton, Kyle Anderson, Brandon Clark. I thought that was interesting. And Taylor Jenkins basically said, they want to see that lineup a little bit more, because at the end of the day, and this is what, I think, Tyus Jones is too good to play 8 or 9 minutes, because Ja Morant's going to be on the court for 39 to 40 minutes in the postseason. Tyus Jones has been way too good to play 8 or 9 minutes. You have to find other ways to get him on the court. Getting Tyus Jones on the court requires going to some of those 2-point guard lineups. So the question in this game against the Knicks, as you, the fans, you should watch. Will Taylor Jenkins go to Tyus Jones again a little bit early? It's those small rotation decisions where throughout the course of a game you may not pay close attention to, but you should pay close attention to those decisions, because those decisions are giving you a look at the ideas, what the Grizzlies want to do for the playoff stretch, what they want to do down the stretch of this season to see what works and what doesn't work. That's what you pay attention to just as much as paying attention to, the team winning, how the team is playing. Who's on the court is what's important, because that's what the coaches are really trying to figure out right now. And speaking of that, like who's on the court, DeAnthony Melton is another guy from the rotational perspective. Where will he play? How much will he play? And I asked that question because Dillon Brooks will be back soon. The latest injury report, Dillon Brooks was upgraded to doubtful for the game against the Knicks. Doubtful means doubtful, He's unlikely to play, but upgraded. Dillon Brooks has been listed as out every single game since after that Clippers game where he was hurt in the second quarter and he twisted his left ankle. He's been listed as out in every single game preceding that moment. Now, for the first time, he is listed as doubtful. He's done 5-on-5, which Taylor Jenkins said he had to do. He's done 2-on-2, 3-on-3. He's done contact. All of these things Taylor Jenkins described as the last steps for Dillon Brooks to get back. It may not be this home game. It may come in the Sunday's game against the Oklahoma City Thunder, which will be a great time to bring it back to a young team that isn't playing great basketball. But back to D'Anthony Melton here. Dillon Brooks will be back. We just mentioned Tyus Jones getting more minutes with John Morant. Where does D'Anthony Melton figure in all of this? He's an important player. D'Anthony Melton, for me, he's one of the guys I like to watch the most because he's so active defensively. And when you talk about how the Grizzlies wreak havoc, D'Anthony Melton's hands are all over that. Near the top of the NBA in deflections, leads the Grizzlies in deflections. He's a monster. I love the way he plays defensively. Offensively, there's something left to be desired there. So he takes a lot of quick shots. I like when he pushes the basketball. For better or for worse, it's the way the Grizzlies play. So you take the good when when he pushes the basketball and it turns into a transition 3-pointer for someone or alley-oop. And then there are other times where it turns into a turnover or a bad pass. You take the good with the bad. D'Anthony Melton, he is a playoff type player to me. He's that guy alongside, Dillon Brooks, who you can have, like, if you end up playing a Clippers and they have Norman Powell and Paul George, or somehow Kawhi Leonard gets back and you have Kawhi Leonard and Paul George, and you need that, D'Anthony Melton alongside Dillon Brooks and, those guys to be able to guard these wings, D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards, who the Grizzlies will probably match up in the first round right now. So there's a lot from a rotation perspective that I think, fans keep an eye on. It's not going to be the same rotation in this game and these games going forward when Dillon Brooks gets back. But not even if Dillon Brooks doesn't play in this game against the Knicks, still, will Tyus Jones come in earlier? Because that could be a sign that the Grizzlies, when the postseason gets here, you're going to see some more Tyus Jones, John Morant lineups to get Tyus Jones on the court more, or to give John Morant a break on the offensive end, which is something, fans don't often see that part of the game. These guys have energy bars. they get tired. One way to preserve energy for a point guard is not bringing the ball up the court. So you will have a guy like Tyus Jones who can offset that for John Morant, which will give him those little small rests within the game. So his 40 minutes played could look different from 40 minutes played in another game, just by little things like that. But thank you for making Locked On Grizzlies your first listen every day. And we're going to be back Monday. Monday is going to be a fun episode. We're going to break down and recap not only the Knicks game and performance, but the first game of the 4-game road trip against the Oklahoma City Thunder. Dillon Brooks could be back in that game. Who knows? If he's back, we'll have a lot more to talk about. But before you leave, make sure your second listen is Locked On NBA, where the experts are covering the biggest stories around the NBA every Monday through Friday in less than 30 minutes. So, there are 30 teams in the NBA. You can get the biggest stories, the best news with the best insight in less than 30 minutes, wherever you get your podcast. So thank you for listening to Locked On Grizzlies, and we'll see you next week